but thank you, Ken, for the introduction. You know, we have a great board of directors. So Ken, Mike Hong of the Wilder Foundation is our current chair. In January, Ken will become our chair. Mary was a prior chair. The Federal Reserve is able to attract terrific people. Richard has served on the National Advisory Council as well. And so we're really privileged to have such civic leaders involved in the Fed. Now, let me just spend a minute or two and talk about why I'm here and why the Fed is here, because most people don't know this. And if you don't know it, it's okay. I didn't know it before I went to Washington. And then we'll get into the subject, because I want to talk to you about education. So our country has hated the idea of having a central bank. If you look back through American history, the first central bank was created by Alexander Hamilton. It lasted around 20 years. The reason our country hated having a central bank is we didn't like concentrated power in the hands of these mysterious evil bankers, for lack of a better word. And so begrudgingly, so they let the first central bank lapse. And then in the late 1800s, the country was racked with a lot of financial crises. And Congress said, what's going on? Why do we have so many financial crises? How come Europe isn't being hammered by all these financial crises? And that's because Europe had central banks, like the Bank of England, goes back hundreds of years. So the compromise was in 1913, Congress said, okay, if we have to have a central bank, fine, but we don't want it all concentrated in Washington, D.C. So the compromise was, we'll have some of the officials in Washington, D.C. appointed by the President of the United States. That's the Board of Governors. That's Janet Yellen, who you've heard about. And then we'll have other members of leadership distributed around the country in 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. And that's the Minneapolis Fed. That's why there's a Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. And the president of that bank, that's me, is appointed by a local board of directors. So Ken was very involved in that search. And my job, our jobs at the Minneapolis Fed, are to represent our region and bring a local perspective when we go back to Washington to set monetary policy. So our region is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, part of Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, and part of Wisconsin. And so me getting out in the district, meeting with people, is not only important to let them know what we're doing, but it's equally important, or more important, for me to hear from them what's happening in your industry, in your neighborhood, so I can collect that intelligence and bring it back, and it can influence policymaking in Washington. So I just want to level set. That's why there's a Minneapolis Fed. That's why we're here. That's why it's critical that I hear honestly from you what's on your mind. Now, Congress has given us what's called a dual mandate that you'll probably hear about if you read about the Fed. And that means Congress has said, Federal Reserve achieve, number one, stable prices, and that's what we define as 2% inflation, not too fast economic growth, not too slow and steady, or steady even is what you call it. 2% inflation, and then maximum employment. Maximum employment means as many Americans who want to work, are able to find a job. That second piece is somewhat unique in that we have this dual mandate. Some other central banks just have a single mandate, which is just focused on inflation. I think our dual mandate works. Now, there could come a time when these two objectives are in conflict with one another. So if we have high inflation and high unemployment, how do we trade off? How do we decide where to optimize around? I think most of the time it's not a conflict. And right now, if you look at where the economy is right now, inflation is coming in a little bit below our target. If you look at core inflation, around 1.8, a little bit below that 2% target. And I think there's still some slack in the job market. So these two things are not in conflict. And that's why in the last FOMC meeting, I voted against raising interest rates, because I think in both cases we could do a little bit better. Now, the reason I want to talk about that is because this is where education comes in. So you think about, what does it take to achieve maximum employment as a country? It's not just about interest rates, certainly. It's not just about how well the business sector is doing. It's also about how educated and how much skill the population has, potential employees have. And I know as I travel all around the district, I hear over and over and over again from businesses large and small, we can't find workers, we can't find skilled workers, we can't even find workers who are trainable, who have the basic skills that we could invest in to train to do these jobs. So when I think about the Federal Reserve and our mandate, maximum employment means education is enormously important to the Federal Reserve. Now, we know that monetary policy cannot solve some of these distributional outcomes. We can't use monetary policy to fix schools. Right? That's kind of intuitively obvious. But we have world-class researchers, economic policy researchers at the Fed. So if we can do the research, look at the data, do the analysis, present those findings to the public, then potentially other policymakers could pick that up and take it forward. Maybe Congress, maybe the state legislator, maybe governors, et cetera, could take that forward. So this is what I want to talk about today. Now I know, I've done a little bit of homework. I know this group is enormously involved in education. Charlie talked about it. And you've been enormously involved in education for a long time. And one of the things that I found about the Minnesota is, I'm not saying this to flatter you. I've lived all across the country. This is unique in having a business community that is this civically engaged. And it's a real source of power and strength. If you all want to get something done, you can pretty much get it done. I mean, not anything, but you've got a better shot at getting it done than just about anywhere else because of all of your involvements. And so speaking to you is a great opportunity for me. When I travel around our district, this district has a lot going for it. A very diverse set of industries. Think about it, almost every major industry in the US economy is represented meaningfully here in the region. A pretty educated, quite educated workforce. A lot of natural resources. So we've got a lot going for us. But people will ask me, what has surprised me about this region? One of the things that has surprised me that you're aware of is the extent of our disparities. So the population on the whole is doing very well in Minnesota, but our disparities are bigger than most of the country. And that really is a head scratcher for me. And so I started asking our researchers at the Minneapolis Fed and around the whole Federal Reserve System, what's the root cause of these disparities? Not just in Minnesota, but nationally. What's the root cause? And I was surprised how little we knew. I'll give you a statistic. In the US, across the whole country, at any given time, recession or booming economy, black unemployment in America is almost always twice white unemployment. So if it's a booming economy and white unemployment is 4, very good bet that nationally black unemployment is going to be 8. If it's a recession and black unemployment is 8, pretty good bet, white unemployment is 8, pretty good bet black unemployment is going to be 16. So I started asking, why? Even if you take education for education, college graduate against college graduate, it's still 2 to 1. High school dropout against high school dropout, it's still 2 to 1. Why? I was amazed we don't know. And so if we don't even know why, we're not in a position to come up with policy solutions. And so I started talking to people around the Fed about this, including with Chair Yellen, and I said, we need to do our part as a Federal Reserve. We know we cannot solve distributional outcomes with monetary policy. But if we can do the research to analyze it, understand it, and inform the public, then that's a real contribution we can make. So Ken mentioned in January, we announced what we're calling the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute at the Minneapolis Fed, focusing on analyzing and understanding these distributional outcome challenges. And we've recruited some of the best academics in the world to partner with us, not just from the U, but all across the country. And we're bringing visiting scholars into Minneapolis beginning this summer to work with us on these issues. This is a long-term initiative, right? These problems are decades or longer in the making. We're not going to come up with a magic bullet in a year or two, but we got to get going, and we have to do our part. And I know you all are supportive of that. All right, so now I want to talk about education, and I want to hear from you. The point of my talk today is I want to get your feedback on your appetite to go further in education. You're already doing a lot, I know it. You're fighting these battles, you've been fighting it for a long time, and you're making progress. But as a nation, we are not making progress nearly fast enough. Not even close. And let me show you some data. So this is 4-year graduation rate. So the percentage of students that graduate high school within 4 years by race for the US. White is around 87%, black 73, 74%, Hispanic 75, 76, Native American around 70%. The gaps are huge. If you look in the last 20 years, so 1997 to today, 10 million American kids have dropped out of high school. It's about 1 per minute, the average that we're going right now. This is national statistics. And I know you know this. This is a crisis. My message to you is it's time we treat it like a crisis. The time for incrementalism is long since past. One of the things I learned in 2008 is you do not tackle a crisis with small policies. You tackle a crisis with overwhelming force. I say this requires overwhelming force. Now, what is it for Minnesota? It's worse. And this is what's so heartbreaking and shocking at the same time. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. You've been working on this a long time. Look at the gaps, how much worse they are for the minority populations here. Now, if we look at unemployment, now this maps right to unemployment rates. If you look at unemployment for the United States, white unemployment's a little below 5, black unemployment around 10. I told you it's about 2 to 1. Hispanic unemployment around 7, Native American around 10. Minnesota. Now, we don't have data from the BLS for Native Americans. That's why there's no bar here. Whites in Minnesota are doing better than the national average. African Americans doing considerably worse. Hispanics doing a little bit better. We don't know why this is. And we need to know why this is. But we know part of it is education. Okay, so let me go to the next thing. This is the data I'm about to show. All of this is public information. You know as well as I do, based on your focus on education, education needs to be the great equalizer in our society. Right? It's the one tool we have more than any other that can break the cycle of poverty. Because once you reach that one child and that kid gets a good education, his or her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, their lives are transformed. It's literally that powerful. Now, who needs the best teachers in a community? It's kids whose parents never went to college. It's low-income kids. It's the minority kids who are just trying to break into the American dream. So this data is for Minneapolis public schools. The more diverse the population, the less experienced the teachers. And this is right off of their website. Anybody can pull it down themselves. So the kids who need the best teachers are getting those who have the least experience. I mean, it's not surprising, but it's frustrating when you look at the data and it's staring at you the way it is right here. Now, if we look at it by poverty. So this is percentage of students who have free or reduced lunches. So this is a proxy for poverty. The more low income the school or the lower income the school, the less experienced the teachers they get. Obviously, that's not fair. The kids who need the best teachers are getting those with the least experience. All right, so now what I want to talk to you about is what are some, I just came up with a handful, talking to my staff and people around the country that I've talked to on education, a handful of bold ideas that I want to get your reaction to. See if you think these are worth considering, if these are things, I'm not here to lobby you, but just get you thinking about other kinds of bold ideas. I know and the Minneapolis Fed has long been proponents of early childhood education scholarships, and you all are strong supporters of that. That's fantastic. Keep pushing. All right, that's critically important. Keep pushing. I want to show you some other ideas. Okay, and then get your reaction to it, and then we're going to throw it open and have a discussion. One idea, amend the Minnesota State Constitution. All right, in some states, California led the way in this, and then it got overturned in appeal. But if you amended the Minnesota State Constitution to make it explicit that every child in Minnesota has a constitutional right, civil right, to a high-quality education, that literally could be transformative. Because if it's a civil right for every kid in Minnesota, that ends up being a legal tool that you can use to take on some of the biggest education obstacles. So in California, the lawsuit that originated this idea went after things like teacher tenure and last in, first out. And they won the first round, and then it got appealed to the California Supreme Court, and they were overturned on appeal. Relative to California, the Minnesota State Constitution is pretty weak on education. But constitutions can be amended. And so if the state were to decide to amend the Minnesota State Constitution to make education an unequivocal civil right, that could be very powerful over the long term in terms of addressing some of the barriers to the education reforms you want to have. By the way, politically it may cost you to get it passed, but there's no budget impact to amending the state constitution. Second, so I told you that the lowest income kids have the least experienced teachers. Why not put out a giant carrot and say, hey, here are the lowest 5% schools in the state, pay them double. It's about $100 million a year. And attract the very best teachers from across the state of Minnesota to come in. The kids who need the best teachers will get the best teachers, and if they don't perform, send them back to their old schools. Again, I'm being provocative by saying pay them double. You don't actually need to pay them double, I think, to attract them. But my point is there, a giant carrot to attract the very best teachers to the kids who need them most. I think that could be transformative. Implement dispassionate accountability. One of the things I learned about Minnesota, as you know, invented charter schools. But I've also learned that we don't shut down bad charter schools in Minnesota. We're too nice. And so the charter movement is hurt by that. Because now the narrative is charter schools don't do any better, because if you look at the averages are kind of mixed. But if we actually implemented dispassionate accountability and really went aggressive after poor performing schools, that could change. Now, there's a market failure in K through 12. The market failure is most people think it's a little bit like Congress or like the Federal Reserve. You know the old joke, most people don't like Congress, but they like their congressman or they like their congresswoman. Same thing with the Federal Reserve. I think the local reserve bank is probably more popular than the Fed as a whole. People don't generally like the school system, but they tend to like their kid's neighborhood school and their kid's third grade teacher, even if that neighborhood school isn't very good. So what some states have done is they put letter grades on schools, A, B, C, D, F, because it's very hard for the parents to ignore if their kid's school gets a D or an F, even a C, and they demand change. So dispassionate accountability could be some non-political, non-partisan body that's objectively assessing schools and putting letter grades on schools, and if they don't shape up, replace the management, replace the staff, and if necessary, shut them down. It's very controversial, but if you don't, there is a market failure, and success needs to be rewarded and failure needs to be punished. Extend the school year and the school day for low-income kids. All the data shows summers are devastating for low-income kids. The education gap just blows out over the course of the summer. Go year-round for low-income kids. And you're already behind scholarships for early learning, K through 12 scholarships potentially for low-income kids. Again, your focus on focusing resources on low-income kids, you're exactly right to do that, because middle class and well-to-do kids are doing fine. They're doing great. They've got after-school programs. They've got summer programs. Focus the taxpayer dollars on the kids who need it most. And one of the things about, I know you all are proponents of choice, as am I. You know, middle class and rich kids already have choice. They either send their kids to private school or they move to a better district. It just drives me crazy that as a country we're determined to prevent low-income families from having the same choices that middle class and well-to-do families have. And so I applaud you for what you are doing. And then others. These are just 5 examples of bold, what I consider to be bold ideas to try to move the needle. And would love to hear your reactions. Tell me you don't like them. Tell me what ideas you do like. Neel, Richard.
Number 2, I like a lot, but you know, studies also say that the principal has a remarkable impact on the teacher's performance. And then my daughter's a 28-year-old school teacher in California, and she would tell you that she wants to teach in a low-income school, but the safety factor is remarkably important. And there's a need to put a safer environment around that so that it's not the money they make, it's the impact they can have, but the risk that they take personally is greater than you want anybody in your family to take, right? But I really like the principal piece, as I put that as another big lever.
I agree. So yeah, to the Richard's early part, for the folks at home may not have heard it, was the comment on how important the principals are. I agree 100%. You know, I've visited schools around California and some in Minnesota that are working miracles. I mean, they're wonderful schools, having great outcomes with low-income kids whose parents never went to college. And it almost always starts with a great principal who's a visionary leader, who recruits like-minded teachers. They create a culture of high expectations and teamwork, and they do have great outcomes. So I agree 100%, Richard. Thank you for that comment.
You know, Chris Policinski from Land O'Lakes. Thank you for the compliment about the business community being engaged in topics. And you're right, this has been one we've been talking about for a long time. I look at your list, and my reaction is, in part, what are the barriers that you see to this list? Because this is a terrific list, and I've seen other lists, but it doesn't seem like we get them done.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on barriers?
I mean, I think the barriers are, so the question was, what are the barriers to this list or other lists getting done? I think the barriers are political will. I think it's, you know, I gave a speech a few weeks ago at a Federal Reserve Community Development Conference, full of, a lot of whom were educators. And it was some of the same statistics. And I said, this is a national crisis. It's time we treat it like a crisis. I was surprised. People were not pushing back on my solutions. They were saying there's no crisis. We're making progress. I couldn't believe it. There's no crisis. And 10 million American kids have dropped out of school in the last 20 years. So I think it is one of waking people up and saying we do have a national crisis, but we can do something about it. I think most people are willing to do these types of things or other things if they had some confidence it would lead to better outcomes.
So
Doug.
Doug Baker, Ecolab.
Here's the mic's right next to you. There you go. Oh, there you go.
Still Doug Baker, Ecolab. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, and probably something that needs to be on the list. So I think the list has got a number of creative ideas that could potentially drive change, which is what you're trying to provoke. But I think you got to exactly the issue that went to my mind, which is when you go out and talk about the issue, and so we've got a particular issue in Minneapolis and St. Paul school districts where we literally have the 50th and 49th worst outcomes for African American and Hispanic kids in terms of graduation rates. I mean, we're at the bottom, and people say, "Oh, it's because of whites." That is absolute graduation rates. I mean, it's terrible. But we do not have agreement that we have a crisis. We have a lot of people dodging this. I mean, it's going to blood on the hands of all of us in a number of ways because you're dooming these kids. So here, I think we also have to have ideas around how are we going to get people to understand the depth of this crisis and the depth of the challenge so that you get a rallying moment. So TARP, there was clear crisis,
Right.
right? It took a while for public to catch up with how deep it was because
Right.
everybody didn't have the same information. But at this point, everybody doesn't have the same information here. So I think there's got to be some drive publicly to make this issue and create awareness around this issue and how important it is for the long-term health of this country. If you go back to what made us so strong, if you go back to like the early 1800s, the number of people that could read in our society was like quadruple that in Europe.
Yeah.
And we educated the masses much before Europe did, and it gave us a huge advantage for decades and generations. And so, I mean, this is a big issue that's going to burn us ultimately.
I'm with you 100%. Your data is exactly right. In fact, the rest of the world is catching up to our education lead. We still have a little bit of an education lead, but everybody else is catching up. And so it's a huge driver of our country's competitiveness. And you're also right that our democracy responds to a crisis much better than it deals with problems on the horizon or slow burning problems. I don't know. I mean, I don't stand here before you today to know how to create that sense of urgency.
Well, but I think if you have transformation, I think one of the key things we have to do is get the public to buy in, because there's not enough pressure on politicians, not enough pressure on the unions to change. I mean, this is
Yeah.
the problem is we've got to create that pressure, and that's going to come from large groups buying into this challenge.
But I would say, and maybe I don't want to put this all on your shoulders collectively, but I would think that this community is better positioned to take this on than anyone else, because you have the business community that is very powerful here and very committed to these kind of issues. If it's not going to happen here, I don't know where it's going to happen.
And I think we agree with that, and we've been on it.
I know you have. I know you have.
And I'm not trying to, but I think, should do a lapel mic. Wrap it up. I would say I agree with that this community, we have a better chance. But what I guess I'm pointing out is what does transformation look like? I think we've got to have ideas up there about driving awareness and driving broad understanding of the challenge in front of us so we can galvanize the community. Because I don't think the business community can do it alone.
Right.
I think we've proven that. So ultimately, I think the list, we also need to make sure that we drive people's understanding around this issue and the challenge.
Fair point.
Neel, thank you. First of all, Mike McFadden from Lazard. Thank you for taking on this issue. An observation, education, the conversation around education has become part of a very hyper-partisan debate. And you can talk about this as the president of the Fed in Minnesota in a way that's nonpartisan. You could talk about this same thing as a candidate for governor in California, and all of a sudden, half of the population is going to turn off, right? Because it's political, it's not policy. So kudos for taking this outside of politics. And I think that's what the business community has a unique opportunity to do also, to take it out of politics, talk about what's right for our community and for our kids, especially our kids that are most at risk. Somewhat to Doug's comment, can you, as you look around the United States, who's doing it well? I mean, are there a couple states that are leading the pack in terms of education reform and have data to support that the policies that they've implemented have actually helped the students?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are some relatively small scale in terms of the nation. If you look at Louisiana, it's devastating. Hurricane Katrina came in, basically wiped out the school system, and they rebuilt it around charters with choice and with accountability. And independent studies have shown they are making quite remarkable progress. Is it game over, victory? No, but they are making progress. Boston as well has shown with some of their choice networks are also showing a lot of progress. Again, independent studies have been verifying that they are making strong progress. You've also got the Harlem Children's Zone that our Northside Achievement Zone is modeled after. That's also showing real progress in Harlem. And so there are pockets, but it's not being, from what I can tell, it's not anywhere being done at the scale of a state where you're really seeing these kind of transformations. Microphone for Ken. Oh, gentleman here. Yeah.
Yeah, James Hereford. I'm at Fairview Health Services. Two minor points. One, I just moved from California. I actually voted for you for governor, so sorry about that.
Thank you.
Second, I probably am the only person here who started out their career as a high school math teacher in rural Montana. So I have. Oh, I did too. Did you really? Cool. So we'll compare notes after. You know, I think interesting list, there's nothing to disagree with, but I think the problem is it's largely technical solutions to what is basically a socio-technical problem. Look, societally, we don't believe in science anymore, right? This debate that we're having about climate change is really a debate about the belief in science. Our commitment to mathematics as a country is pathetic. And I would suggest that this room is probably the least likely to appreciate the socio part of this because we're not the people who really don't have that belief. I think whatever you do, you have to think about, in many of the examples you cited, think about that broader socio issue, the family. If the family doesn't believe in education, it's less likely that the children will believe in education and the upward mobility that is bestowed upon them because of that. So I think I love the list. We need to think more broadly in terms of the socio aspect of this if we really want to have a hope of being successful.
So I agree with you that all of these other factors, especially the family, are enormously important. But I would just respectfully say I have seen schools with my own eyes that can take kids from the most challenging family backgrounds and still have terrific outcomes. And so my only concern is if we have to solve everything, family engagement, healthcare, all these other housing, which are all important, we're never going to get going. And so for me...
Again, I don't disagree with that, but I think just as anything in business, we have to think about scale.
Yes.
Because I can find a solution, a positive example for almost any intervention.
I agree with you.
The question is, does it scale well at the level that you're describing to?
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Yeah, and that we can sustain over time is a really good point. So I think that's also got to be part of the calculus here in terms of can we put solutions in place that actually scale? Because there have been a lot of advances that have come, not sustained, can't scale, nice point solution, but this is a much bigger and more endemic issue.
I'm with you. Thank you. Ken?
So Neel, I think as this conversation, I think, shows on this issue, you can go from a 0 to 100 questions and directions in about 10 minutes. It's so complicated, and there are so many different ways that you could go and so many different approaches. So where I think that you could add tremendous value is, I think we need three things that really work. I mean, to some of the other points that have been made here. Thing one, I think, that we already know works is early childhood. Mm-hmm. There's a huge amount of data. We know it works. There models have been tested and evaluated here in Minnesota and around the country. And I think just, giving some support and force behind that idea could be hugely transformative. And then if you could help us find, because it's so complicated, we need to be able to rally behind three things that we're certain will make a difference. Otherwise, it becomes a debate that goes on forever. So three things. I mean, a second thing I think you started to touch on, but there's a lot of learning on length of day, length of year, higher focus on basic skills. I mean, deepening the data and the effectiveness of those kinds of approaches so that we could, get the will to really rally behind those I think could be hugely helpful. But I think the goal should be three big things that work in schools that we could then rally behind as a business community. Otherwise, We fragment. There
Yeah.
are too many directions you can go in.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. And by the way, hopefully, our new research institute, that may be an output of that. You know, I'm with you. Thank you. Others? Hi.
Hi, I'm Shelley Ibach with Sleep Number. Yeah, I heard from you, though, that the source, or the starting point, is a common understanding of the problem. So before we jump into, are these the right solutions, and let's align on the solution, gaining a widespread common understanding of what the problem is that we want to solve and a vision for, what we want to achieve, perhaps might be the important starting point, because the minute you get into solutions, everybody wants to debate the solution, and I think your starting point today was, people do not understand what is at risk here and what the core problem is and how it will manifest itself. So perhaps that's where we need to invest our time. It's all in the setup in order to get to a sustainable solution.
Great point. Thank you.
Neel, thanks for being here. And it's a little bit different, but a little bit related. So it's obviously a crucial topic, crucial issue for us. And to Mike's point, using your position in promoting this issue is a helpful platform. I've seen you taking on other issues as well in the community. Where does this rank, and what other topics or issues like this are you focusing on?
This is very high. I mean, this is a huge long-term, people ask me, it's funny, whenever I get involved in an issue now at the Fed, people assume that I'm positioning myself to run for office again. Like, they always question my motives. It's like, once I ran for office, I'm forever tainted. But I ran for office for the same reason that I joined the Fed, which is I care deeply about public policy. And I want to make a difference. I want us all to make a difference on the biggest public policy issues facing the country. So we started out on the issue of too big to fail. And we certainly haven't solved it, but we've come up with a proposal that we think could really address it. And we're trying to get it out there and trying to talk about it as much as we can for people to consider it. This is the next one, but this is a long-term one. This is going to take years and years of continuous work and learning and meeting with people and hearing ideas. And then I'm open-minded. The bottom line is I want the Minneapolis Fed to take on the biggest economic policy challenges we have as a region and we have as a country. And I'm agnostic about what they are, as long as we have good ideas and analysis behind our proposed solutions. And so, I mean, I'm always, before I even started, so just after I was appointed to the bank, before I was actually at the bank, I met with all of our economists. And I said, I want you to go off and think about the biggest economic challenges we have as a country over the next decade. Could be anything. Let's get your ideas on the table. Let's talk about them. Let's figure out which ones we can do something about or make some contribution to. And so this is what's a huge focus for us for the future, but we're not going to stop there. We'll see what else comes up. Mary,
I'd
can you give her the
like
mic?
to, I think, echo a comment that was made earlier, and that is, I worry that all the work that we've done as the business community comes off as we have a political position. And so it's not that the business community has a stake in the workforce of the future and the economic vitality of the region. It's that we come from our own political self-interest. And so I think one of the biggest helps that the Fed could create is an umbrella that's bigger than one political point of view, that's focused on solving problems, not pointing fingers. And finding a home for that has been enormously challenging. We've created, I don't know how many organizations to try to do exactly that. And a year and a half into it, pretty soon it's, well, there's the business community again.
Right.
Looking out for their own self-interest. And so if you could accomplish that, I think that would be a really powerful step towards transformation.
I think it's a great point. And I think that some folks that you know very well from the Minneapolis Fed, like Art Rolnick and others, their work on early childhood education, I think it did provide some of that credibility, saying this is just independent analysis, that there is a positive ROI.
And the challenge is, even great work like arts is now viewed through a political prism.
Yeah. I know.
It's
And that's
not easy.
I know it's not easy. And that's, by the way, that's a risk that I am aware that it's not risk-free for the Fed to have me wading into some of these issues. because people could then question our motives as an institution, and we have to protect the credibility of the Fed and the independence of the Fed. But that's why our foundation is always going to be the analysis. What does the analysis show us? Here's the analysis. If you disagree, let's see your analysis, but we're going to do the analysis, let the analysis do the talking for us. Okay.
Shirley Weaver, let me just add and give you comfort. And first, thank you for being here. This has been the most important issue I think we've dealt with over the last 10 years as an organization. And the men and women here are fearless, and they aren't afraid of big challenges or big ideas. You should know that for each of those bullets, we've been publicly supportive. We are part of a lawsuit in Minnesota addressing the California challenge
Okay,
around
correct. I
LIFO.
didn't
So we're
realize
part of that. The teacher salaries, when Governor Pawlenty was governor, he proposed $100,000 salaries for teachers who would take on tough assignments in the heart of Minneapolis, for example. We support getting rid of bad charter schools. We support that. Interesting, on the school year and school day, we fought that at the legislature. You know who we lose to? Resorts. Resorts. The resort community in Minnesota is very strong, and they do not want to, they want to get out of there, right, before Labor Day, and they want to start
summer
after
vacation
Memorial Day. Yeah,
protected.
it's about, so we continue to fight that fight, and we're going to continue to do it, but we got to beat the resorts in order to have a longer school year. And the scholarships, as you said, were there. So just know that this group of CEOs is 100% behind you. Mary's right. If we can figure out a way to do it in a way that comes off as less partisan, that's important, because we aren't partisan about this. This is about talent
Yeah,
and
I
growing
hear you.
talent here.
Good.
So thank
Well,
you.
thank you all very much. I really appreciate your opportunity.
Good job.
Thank you very
We're on your
much.
team.
Thank
We're
you.
on Team Kaskari.